Welcome to the new philosophy discussion series that's hosted by For the New Christian Intellectual. It's called the Objectivism Book Study. Today is our first day discussing this book from Leonard Peikoff called Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. What is the goal of our book study here? This is a chance for all of us to sharpen our philosophical understanding and to dig into the details of Ayn Rand's ideas to see where Christians might agree or disagree with her system. It will also be a chance to build rapport with each other and to outline what will eventually become a robust Christian response to Ayn Rand's philosophy. Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, is Leonard Peikoff's complete presentation of Rand's philosophy of objectivism. You're going to come away with a solid understanding of this philosophy, objectivism, and of the convictions that we hold at For the New Christian Intellectual, which are sometimes aligned and sometimes not aligned with the objectivist movement. At For the New Christian Intellectual, or FTNCI, we aim to create a Christian reconstruction of significant parts of Ayn Rand's philosophical system. We aim to correct the errors that are inherent in a philosophy that rejects Christian teaching. As a participant in this study, you're going to get a chance to play a part in this effort at reconstructing by contributing questions and contributing discussion points. So you're welcome to use the physical book, or if you want the audio book or an ebook. I think physical book is going to be the best because this is some pretty weighty material. We're going to review 2 chapter subsections per week, typically. That's about 8 to 15 pages. It varies. And so this is a pretty slow pace, not that many pages per week. It's a pace that is suitable for heavy philosophical material with a lot of time for questions and answer sessions. So please come having already read the section for that week, and you're welcome to read ahead in the text. We'll call the text OPAR for short. You're also going to find this whole book study more accessible if you've already read Atlas Shrugged. And if you would like to listen to the first 9 episodes of our podcast, you can find that at christianintellectual.com/podcast. The first 9 episodes are an orientation to what do we at FTNCI want to do with Ayn Rand's ideas. So if you're concerned, if you're thinking, well, that's not orthodox to be a Christian interested in Ayn Rand, well, we are interested in Ayn Rand. That doesn't mean that we embrace all of her ideas. So each week I'm going to be introducing the reading and then guiding the discussion. But our goal is going to be open discussion. And to some extent, I'll ask you to raise your hand, or I'll moderate to make sure that we're not all talking at the same time. But we are not aiming that we are going to all 100% agree. We're not trying to indoctrinate all of the points under discussion. The aim here is to explore where can Christians agree, where can they not agree with Rand, and where might they agree with Rand, depending on where you lie on different issues. So the claims in this book, they're made by Leonard Peikoff, but for simplicity, I'm just going to refer to them as Rand's ideas. I'm just going to assume that Peikoff is accurately representing Ayn Rand's views here. All right, let's jump into the reading for this week. The preface is where we start, and then chapter 1, the first and second subsection, reality and existence, consciousness, and identity as the basic axioms. So this is several pages. I have 12 plus pages. I'd like to frame the discussion for this week with this introduction. This is adapted from a discussion that I had with Andrew, who is my co-host today. So I asked Andrew, what is the truth that you are most sure of? And what is the most logically basic fact? And I said, here I'm not asking for a tautological statement like A is A. I'm asking for a fact about the universe. So it would be something like things exist. To say that if a thing exists, then it exists, that's a tautology. But to say there are things that exist, that's not a tautological statement. That's a statement about the world, about the universe. So I once asked that same question to a seminary friend of mine when I was going to Southern Seminary in Louisville. And this friend is now a professor that even teaches philosophy classes. To give you an idea, this is pretty representative of what is being taught in the seminaries these days. I asked him, what is the most basic question? Or what most logically basic fact? Or what is the truth that you're most sure of? And his answer was, well, the most basic thing that I know, the thing that I'm most sure of, is that there is a good God who exists and who created me and who loves me. This is the typical Christian answer to that kind of question. Now, if you're familiar with the ideas of Cornelius Van Til and presuppositionalism, that is a presuppositionalist type of answer. It's a presuppositionalist type of view of faith and knowledge and how those two ideas relate. And that's going to be opposed to what I call the objective view of things, the view that upholds objectivity, and the view that Ayn Rand has, which she called objectivism. So the average Christian in our mainstream Christianity today, whether they are explicitly Van Tillian or just eclectic or somewhat influenced by Van Tillian ideas, or perhaps just haven't really thought through these things, they tend to assume that God's existence is the truth of which we, the creatures, are and ought to be most certain. They tend to believe that anything other than this would be a failure of piety. The unchallenged assumption is that the thing that is most important would necessarily be the thing that is known first. So I want you, in your mind, to distinguish between what is the thing that's most important in the whole universe? Well, obviously God. Does that mean that it's the thing that's known to us first? To us, creatures. And the presuppositionalist typically gets this wrong. They typically think, well, there can be no knowledge unless there's knowledge of the greatest thing first. And the answer that you can give to that kind of thinking is an answer that I've heard from John Warwick Montgomery. And I think this is a useful analogy. He says, which is greater, the herald or the king? The herald comes first to point to the king. The fact that a truth comes first to our attention means that it is most foundational or basic or early within the human process of gaining knowledge. But that has no bearing on whether or not we consider it to be the truth that is the most glorious out of all the truths. So it's the typical confusion that we see between metaphysics, otherwise known as ontology, versus epistemology. We have to distinguish those two things. Just because smoke always follows fire, it doesn't mean you have to distinguish, like the fire led to the smoke, but the smoke indicates the fire. You have to be able to distinguish between those two viewpoints on those two things. God is ontologically prior to all things, but God is not prior to other things in the order of human knowledge, any more than the king would be prior to his own herald in the order of knowledge that the peasants have. I mean, imagine the king walks into town first and then the herald follows. It's ridiculous, right? The herald is supposed to come first. Now, why is the herald necessary? Well, it's because we're peasants. In the grand scheme of things, we are peasants. And, if we were God, then we would start with God in our order of knowing, but we are creatures. So while mainstream Christians might try to claim that their approach is one that properly glorifies God, their approach to epistemology is built on assumptions that are incompatible with the kind of world that God has made. They might even say that the approach that I'm taking toward knowledge is man-centered. But, that's just like hand-waving. It's just a way to dismiss the discussion. We ought to be discussing whether or not God is glorified by an approach to human knowledge that does not draw distinctions between God and man. That's the question here. I mean, you draw a distinction between the king and the peasants, right? So that's my introduction to what I got out of this chapter from Rand, at least big picture. If you're going to be a truth seeker, you need to understand what honesty is. And what Rand does in this material on axioms is she helps you understand some of the basic components of honesty. An honest person is somebody that doesn't fake reality. So if you're going to analyze this concept of honesty, you have to understand that there is such thing as me thinking of things, me making claims of things, me being conscious of things. You have to understand that there is a reality out there, and that what I claim or what I believe, it either does or does not match the reality. And so Rand says, no matter what you do, you're always going to be making use of certain concepts, the axiomatic concepts. And for her, the axiomatic concepts are existence. There is a world that exists. And consciousness, I am conscious of it. And identity, the things that exist, they are themselves. They are what they are. And to say that it is this is not to say that it is not that. Those are mutually exclusive claims. That's the principle of identity. This set of axiomatic concepts that Rand offers, as you're reading it as a Christian, you might look at it and say, why do we need all this? I like Rand's politics. I like some of the things she says about ethics. I'm a little interested in her epistemology, but on metaphysics, where does this come from? And I'll answer that question by saying I don't know exactly where Rand's discovery of these axiomatic concepts came from. I don't know if it's completely novel to her or if there are other philosophers that have done similar things. I would not be surprised if there are some other Christian philosophers who've said similar things. And actually, that's just a gap in my knowledge. I don't know if, existence, consciousness, identity are axiomatic concepts in other people's systems. But what I do know is that the arguments that Rand gives for why these ought to be treated as basic building blocks of knowledge that are undeniable, that must be used for forming any other knowledge, I think those arguments are certainly persuasive. So that's a little introduction to what we see in the chapter, just to give you maybe some heads up about where we're going to go. I want to share with you an experience I had with, I had a friend who disagreed with me about politics. He was a statist. And I was like, you need to read Rand's book. And he read through it very carefully. He's super intellectually minded, and he read through it. And one of the questions that he kept on coming to was, I don't understand how she got from chapter 1 to chapter 2, and how did she got from chapter 2 to 3. So just as a heads up, as you're reading this OPAR book, be aware that this is a hierarchical presentation of the conclusions of Rand's thought. Now, within this material, you're going to see that there are validations of the concepts, but the validations are presented in barest form, because to present them in any more detail would turn a book that's over 400 pages into a book that's thousands and thousands of pages. In every case, Peikoff had to choose between, was he going to talk about the trees or the forest? And he said, let's talk about the forest. That's just the big picture. So when you're reading through this book, this is very often it comes across as simply making assertions. Now, just because it's doing that doesn't mean that it's being arbitrary or lacking in objectivity. What it is doing is summarizing the findings of Ayn Rand, summarizing the system and how it fits together and what its basic approach to validating each one of the ideas is. That doesn't mean that it's making a massive argument or demonstration or fleshing out of every single point. And Peikoff says that in the beginning. He says, if you use this as your guide to what the complete system of Ayn Rand is, then later on we can go on and write a more detailed book about this or that point. But I want you to understand that that's what he's doing, and it's hierarchical in terms of the fundamentality. So what is the most fundamental item of knowledge that you have? Well, the most fundamental thing that you have, if somebody says, well, I believe that God exists. Well, that's actually not the most fundamental item of knowledge that you would have. Because logically fundamental, remember, it's more logically fundamental to say that there are things that exist than to say that there is this specific thing that exists. And I was sharing this with Andrew. We were talking on the phone last night. Like, let's say there's my dog exists, my cat exists, God exists. You could say of all of those things that they exist. So there's a logical foundational unit when you go to make a claim, and that is the idea of there being something that exists, that is a thing, and I'm conscious of it. All those are just the logical building blocks of any claims. So that's why they belong in chapter 1 in this book. And when my friend who was reading he was reading through this book, and he was trying to figure out, is he moving deductively? Like, is he saying A is A, and then logically he can infer from the fact that A is A that the senses are valid, and logically he can infer from those two things that, and then he goes on to, there's a certain concept, a certain way that concepts are formed, and then he deduces from all that ethics is this, and he deduces from that the correct politics is this. No, this book is presented hierarchically, but it's not presented in the order that somebody would have discovered this knowledge. So keep that in mind as you're going through it, and you're starting to think, why is this included here? It's not included where it is because this is because this is the way that Rand learned it. It's not like Rand just like sat there in a cave and was like, A is A, and then therefore these other things followed. In fact, if you look at the development of Ayn Rand's thought, and if you look at the development of her writing, she started with writing about politics and individualism and collectivism and liberty. And then she began more to write about, well, what does it mean to be a good man? And then eventually she began to go backward according to the philosophical hierarchy from politics to ethics to epistemology. You have much more epistemology present in Atlas Shrugged versus in The Fountainhead or in We the Living or Anthem. And then, after she finished Atlas Shrugged, then she went on and she wrote Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, and she did a lot more of her other writing. The point that I'm making here is that the way that we learn things is by observation, by induction. And Rand made this point. She said that all of the major philosophical discoveries have been philosophical discoveries of induction. That is, looking at observations and then forming generalized conclusions and principles. And I point that out because you need to know going into this that you're going to have a tendency to look at some argument or some fact that is presented in this book and say, oh, and from there it logically follows that, blah, blah, blah. I want you to understand the difference between induction and deduction. If you have a generalization and you cash it out into a specific application, that's called deduction, typically in the form of a deductive inference, like a syllogism. Premise A, premise B, therefore it follows conclusion C. The form of doing that is what most people take thinking to be, and they don't have room in their minds for induction. But you have to understand that the information that is contained in this book was discovered by a process of induction, and it was not discovered in the order that is presented here. This is the order of showing all of the hierarchy of knowledge. And the reason it's in this order is because if you disagree on something in chapter 7, you need to look in previous chapters to figure out where the divergent point was, most likely. It's imagine a tree or a hierarchy. I know I've been speaking for some time, and so I'm going to invite Andrew on. Andrew, would you like to comment on what I've said so far and raise questions or points that you think that we need to make sure to include in the video today?
Sure, I'll give an analogy, and the fact that I'm going to use this is, if certain people see this, it'll drive them crazy that I'm using it because they've used it in a sort of illicit way, but you'll know what I'm talking about. Imagine you're on a diving board, and what you're immediately aware of is the edge of the diving board. But you can realize by standing there that there must be the whole structure of the diving board that's holding that board up. If you equate that to epistemology, if you equate that to our process of learning, the diving board, you can realize that there are facts of reality that you have been aware of, but you haven't identified them as the underlying facts of reality. And you sort of work backwards to realize what you have known the whole time, but you're identifying that as a foundation. And so it's important because that's a big discussion here when he talks about axioms of reality. In fact, I was talking with Cody last night. I said, why are these axioms in the section of the book on metaphysics or the section on what is? Shouldn't these axioms be in the section of the book on how we know? But Cody kind of helped me see the axioms are the thing that we know. Once we start with reality, then we can start, and when we understand some basics about what reality is, then we can start to validate and prove other things on the basis of these facts that we all that are implicit in all other knowledge. And so something that's notable to me is this difference between implicitly understanding that something exists, that there's something out there, that their existence exists, whatever existence may be, it exists, and that I'm aware of it, and that it has some sort of identity. Those things are implicit in even a baby's knowledge, but that's a separate thing from realizing that those are axioms. That distinction is important, and Peikoff discusses it some in here. And earlier, Cody, you mentioned the fact that some people might not know why discussing axioms is important. But there are many reasons that I can think of, but one that comes to my mind first is when we think about reasoning and using our minds to discover what's in the world, or what's in scripture, or what's in our reality of our relationships. It's common, especially after postmodernism, to hear people say, well, you can't really know anything for sure, or you can't really trust your mind, you can't really trust the reasoning process. But once you understand axioms, once you understand, and especially once you identify them, you can have a confidence that knowledge is possible. You don't have knowledge. Understanding axioms doesn't necessarily mean that every single thing that you think is true, but it gives you confidence that reasoning is possible, that knowledge is possible. Because if I try to deny the fact of existence, you're already in the realm of impossibility, because everything you're talking about, every concept you're using is an existent. And so that brings me some comfort if I'm starting to doubt, if I'm inclined or tempted by the culture around me to doubt the ability of my mind to grasp reality at all, which is important to us as Christians, as well as just thinking more broadly as going throughout our daily lives. It's important to have that confidence that we can think and that we can understand truth, and understanding these axioms helps with that. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about the difference between proving an axiom and validating an axiom, and then proving that something is an axiom. Those are three different things. And I'll give kind of a summary, and maybe someone else can unpack it. So on one hand, you have proving that something is an axiom. And that's kind of what Peikoff does here. But he says you can't actually prove the axiom itself, because what proof is, in this technical sense, is to demonstrate that something is true based on other facts. So my wife and I were talking about, we need to get a bookshelf, but let's say that I didn't agree on that. And she was like, okay, well, look, we have all these books. I know that. They need to go somewhere. I know that. A bookshelf will help us do that. I know that. She would be proving that we need a bookshelf based on other things that I know. But if you talk about these axioms, the fact that existence exists, you can't prove that, because that axiom underlies anything else that you want to use to prove it. But there is a way to validate that existence exists. And I thought it was interesting on page 8, Peikoff says, validation I take to be a broader term than proof, one that subsumes any process of establishing an idea's relationship to reality, whether deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, or perceptual self-evidence. And that brings in a really, really interesting idea, which is self-evidence, or immediate awareness, or we use the word direct acquaintance. We're directly acquainted with the fact that something exists. Even when we're babies, we don't know, we can't put it into those terms until we're much older. But you can't escape the fact that there is something, that there's something in front of you, whether it's my laptop screen or a cup or what it is. That's a different discussion. But the fact that there is something, I'm directly acquainted with that, and through that you can validate the notion of existence or the notion of consciousness, because you reflect on, oh, I'm aware of it, and then I'm aware of it, and then I'm aware of it as opposed to this, as opposed to that. And that's why he says that you can only define these axioms ostensibly by basically point. It's kind of like a color. I can't define orange, but I can point to this, and I can't define pink, but I can point to this. It's the same with an axiom. And so I think I've mentioned proving that something is an axiom, and then I mentioned validating an axiom, and then there was one more thing that I said. What was the other?
Well, you were positioning those against the idea that you could actually prove an axiom is true.
Right.
And that's the one that we just can't do.
Right. Yeah. And so those three ideas are very helpful to separate in your mind, because
right.
most people can read this and say, yeah, this is all pretty simple. Yeah, existence exists, and nobody argues with that. But once you can identify it as an axiom, you can say, wow, I never thought about the fact that this actually is implicit in everything I know, everything I'm aware of. So I wanted to just mention those things, and maybe someone else has more thoughts on why that's useful, why it's true, or maybe someone has an objection to it that you've heard from someone else.
Well, Andrew, that's really well said. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I would just point out whenever I say that you cannot prove that the axioms are true, I am making a point about the word proof. I'm saying the word proof is not the appropriate term to use for demonstrating or validating that the axioms are true. Now you can validate the claim that existence exists. You can, and the source of validation is the source of all of our other validations that I'm aware of, which is I'm aware. That's as far back as it goes. It's that direct contact with reality. I'm sure that the presuppositionalists will enjoy thinking about that and trying to figure out how their view disagrees with what I'm saying there. I would just point out before we go on to a couple of questions that one important thing that we could do in this section is we could acknowledge that identifying these axioms is useful for life. It's not just a matter of like a academic discipline to say, well, what is it? What is the very core building block of our knowledge? It's useful for life because once you know that it is an axiom that existence, or an axiomatic concept, that existence is an axiomatic concept, or once you know that consciousness or identity are axiomatic concepts, once you have that, you have a test against other knowledge. So let's say you go to make a claim and you're not sure that this claim is true. You can analyze it by comparing it to those things and ask yourself, is there any way that the claim that I'm making goes against these things that I already directly know to be true? So for example, if you were David Hume and you were thinking that you should be skeptical about whether there's such thing as cause and effect, or you should be skeptical about whether or not there really is such thing as identity or knowledge. Well, all of these things that David Hume is so famous for arguing, they go against the axioms. It goes against the idea of consciousness, for example. So that's one way that you can check. I mean, the axioms make skepticism impossible, and that's if nothing else, that would be a reason why you should take these axioms seriously. The other thing I would say about it is it's very useful for in polemics when you hear somebody else making an argument and you're trying to analyze their argument or their claim, and you're trying to break it down into its constituent pieces. You can find out where they have deviated from the axioms, and then you can point it out to them. This is where you contradict yourself. It's like pointing out, hey, you've broken one of the 3 laws of logic. But it's even more fundamental philosophically than those laws of logic. It's even those laws of logic rest on the axioms. All right, I want to go to Jacob, and then we'll go to Isaac. Go ahead, Jacob.
So a challenge to Andrew and to Cody and myself. I'll answer my challenge. But is what about other facts that are implied by a simple proposition, like I'm aware of my computer screen in front of me, right? So there are axiomatic concepts that are implied by that we've been talking about: existence, consciousness, and identity, and they're necessarily implied, and they're necessarily true, right? That they can't not be true. But what about the fact that God exists? Isn't there a sense in which the fact that God exists is implied by the fact that I'm aware of my computer screen? Because if God didn't exist, then I wouldn't exist, and neither would this computer screen. And so shouldn't we say that the existence of God is also an axiomatic concept, because it's implicitly and necessarily, or it's necessarily implied in every other proposition? I've got an answer, but
Okay.
If you or Andrew want to take a stab at that before I do, go ahead.
Yeah, my answer will be something that is implied is different from something that is immediately known. And so like what you're saying seems to be like the cosmological argument, but that's an argument and it's an inference from something that is observed to something that also must be true. Sort of like I see smoke, therefore there must be fire, because I know that only fire accounts for smoke. But that assumes that I know that only fire accounts for smoke and that I see smoke. And then from those two pieces, I can infer that there was a fire on the basis of the fact that I truly do know that there is smoke. But if I didn't truly know that there was smoke, I couldn't do the inference. And the same thing for, there's the created world and there's God. That's how I'd answer that.
Yeah. Andrew, did you have anything on that, or should I just go ahead and give my answer?
Go ahead. I want to hear your answer.
All right. So I would say we need to be more focused on what exactly the proposition is that we're talking about, right? The content of the proposition, I'm aware of my computer screen, limited just to that proposition, it does only imply those axiomatic concepts. It in itself, without any other information, does not imply that God exists, right? Now, if we stand back and consider that in the context of the rest of our knowledge about the nature of me being a contingent thing, the nature of a computer being a contingent thing, the nature of cause and effect, and a lot of other things, then when you bring all those other facts in, yes, that all leads to the existence of God by necessity, right? And that's where we get things like the cosmological argument, or you could do that with other types of arguments for the existence of God. But that drops the context of what we're talking about. What we're talking about is specifically just the proposition, I'm aware of the computer screen in front of me, considered apart from the context of the rest of our knowledge. And we're saying in just that one proposition, even if you didn't have the rest of the knowledge that we have, in just that one proposition, these axiomatic concepts are necessarily implied in a way that the existence of God is not necessarily implied. The existence of God is necessarily implied only if you add all that additional knowledge.
There's one thing you're saying, Jacob, that they're implied. I don't know if that's consistent with what Peikoff is saying, because I believe that the way that they would understand it is when you have knowledge that there's a computer screen, that you would say that you are immediately aware of the reality that something exists. It's not an inference.
So yeah, I'm not saying it's an inference. I'm using implied in the same way that Peikoff would say it's implicitly necessary.
Okay, it's not. I agree with
that existence exists is implied in the proposition, I'm aware of this computer screen, and that
Right.
consciousness is conscious of something. That A is A. All of those three things are the validity of those three propositions are implied in the proposition, I'm aware of this computer screen.
Whereas,
In a way that the existence of God is not implied.
Right, because to get to the existence of God, you'd have to have another premise.
Exactly. You have to have additional knowledge and additional premises that you're bringing into it.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And I'll also comment on this real quickly because I think it's important and it helps to illuminate what Jacob just said. Thinking about this from Peikoff's point of view, who is an atheist, he actually says on page 5, the concept of existence does not specify that a physical world exists. And that surprised me when I read it again. I had already read this, but it surprised me when I read that. And I had to actually, there's a footnote, there's an end note there, and I had to ask Cody to send me with the end note, and it the end note is a reference to another book. But if you think about it, knowing that something exists is actually different from knowing that a physical world exists. And it's easy to think, just like Jacob's example, well, if I'm aware of the computer screen, doesn't that imply that God exists? Well, as Peikoff is saying, it doesn't even imply that a physical world exists in that very strict, limited sense. Now, for us, with all of the knowledge that we have, if I see this marker, then I can think, oh, yeah, this exists. Well, then that necessarily implies, in a casual sense, that there's something physical because I know this is physical. But even the concept of physical implies all these other concepts like space, extension, weight, things that consciousness doesn't have. And I thought that was very helpful. So even in the terms of the book, you can kind of see that what something serves as a foundation for and what it implies or what it has implicitly in it are kind of two different concepts. So Just wanted to use an example from the book to illustrate that.
All right, I had Isaac up next. Go ahead, Isaac.
I think a good way to think about this, you guys could correct me if I'm wrong, but when Jacob was making his point, it occurred to me that the image of a timeline came to mind, thinking of these things in chronological order. So in Jacob's example, he said, I'm aware of a computer screen in front of me. So the question is, what knowledge, like what's the starting point of our knowledge? And if we say, I see a computer screen in front of me, is that the, what comes, here's the question, is there any knowledge that comes before that statement, that necessarily comes before that statement, that we depend on in saying, I see a computer screen in front of me? So if you think about it in terms of the timeline, and you say the statement, I see the computer screen in front of me, ask the question, okay, is there any knowledge that we depend on that comes before that? And Peikoff would say, yes, axiomatic concepts. You need to, basically you're saying that the computer screen exists. You're saying that you're aware of the computer screen, and you're saying that the computer screen is something. Those are the three axiomatic concepts. These things come before. And then the point of, it's the difference between implication and, what your knowledge depends on. And so if you're talking about, well, don't these things imply that God exists? Yeah, well, that's knowledge that comes after, further down the line of this timeline chronologically. So that's the way I thought of it in those terms. I felt like, or you can think of it as a totem pole, like, what's the base level? It always, the furthest point you can go down in terms of knowledge is axiomatic concepts, and everything builds up from there, even the knowledge that God exists.
I think I would disagree with the use of the word chronological, because I think what we're doing is we're analyzing it in terms of its logical fundamentality.
The totem pole might actually be a better.
That's a good analogy. Yeah.
Because the totem pole stands there at one point, and you can, like he says, a child doesn't know what an axiom is, but they know the axioms. They know the axioms themselves. And you even said axiomatic concepts. They actually might not have a concept of the axiom. There's a difference between the concept in your mind and the content of it. And so, I think the totem pole is. Sorry, Cody, I think I cut you off. You might have been about to say something else.
I just want to clarify. I don't mean literally the knowledge that we acquire over time. I was using the idea of a timeline of chronological order as a hypothetical analogy.
Yeah.
And so, I switched it at the end there to the idea of a totem pole, and it's merely the idea of before and after. Okay, if you say something, ask the question, what knowledge comes before this that makes this knowledge valid, and what comes after? And so the whole idea of, implication of God exists, if you think about it in those terms, I think it makes a little bit more sense. The idea that you get the idea that God exists after, and the axiomatic concepts come before.
Yeah, I think one way that might be helpful is to say that in the statement, this computer screen exists, I see it, I'm conscious of it. It contained within that statement is the idea that there is such thing as existence. There is such thing as consciousness. It's not that you had to have those things prior to being able to see the computer screen, because otherwise, think about, you could do a reductio ad absurdum on that, because then how could a baby ever see anything? The baby becomes immediately aware of his mother or whatever else he sees. And at the exact moment, he also becomes immediately aware that existence is a thing, that things have identity, that he's capable of being conscious of those things. It's all the same thing. It's just viewed from a certain perspective. And that's something that you're going to see within philosophy in general, is very often you have you have concepts that are coterminous with each other, but that are useful to distinguish from one another because they are simply as viewed from a different perspective. Like for instance, existence and identity. The very concept of identity is, for the most part, I mean, I have to double check this, but I think that it's coterminous with the concept of existence, but it's existence as viewed from a different perspective slightly. I think you can find that in Peikoff's chapter. Okay, Jacob, I saw you raised your hand.
Yeah, just real quickly, I think it's helpful, and I know Isaac was saying he was using timeline language as an analogy. In addition to distinguishing between chronological priority and logical priority, there's a third category of metaphysical priority, right? And this is where a lot of presuppositionalists get caught up. So there's actual chronological timelines of what happened before what, right? So like an actual timeline. Then there's logical order or primacy or however you want to put it, which would usually be meant to be sort of synonymous with epistemological, right? But that's the way I'm using it right now. Epistemological order, meaning what concepts must be valid in order for this proposition to be valid. And that's what we've been talking about epistemological priority, where the axioms are the epistemological foundation. And then there's also metaphysical priority. And if we're talking about metaphysical priority, we're talking about what must exist, not what propositions must be true. Well, so when we're talking epistemology, we're talking about our minds and what we believe and what must be true if what we believe is going to be valid, right? With metaphysical priority, we're sort of stepping away from our minds and we're just talking about reality in itself. And we're saying what must exist in order for this to exist, or what must have happened in order for this to have happened. And when we're talking about metaphysical priority, obviously God is a metaphysical fundamental, right? And his existence is fundamental to the existence of everything else, including our own existence, in the same way that water and nutrients are more fundamental than the existence of plant life. And the sun, obviously, right? Those three things are metaphysically prior to plant life. So that's metaphysical priority. We're talking about epistemological priority, and then there's also chronological priority or order. And it's helpful to distinguish between those three things. There's probably other types of order or priority that you could talk about, but it's important to keep those categories distinct as we talk about these things.
I'm curious about this. So it seems like a lot of what we're like, it comes down to sense perception. The thought occurred to me is, well, what if you, for whatever reason, what if you don't trust your senses? Or what if, another way to put it is, what if somebody comes along and says, well, how can you trust your senses? And I'll just like follow that up with the thought that occurred to me is, if somebody came and challenged me and said, like, if I were trying to talk about axiomatic concepts and I use a method of validation to show that that we depend on axiomatic concepts, and it relies on sense perception, and somebody says, well, how can you trust your thoughts? I would say, I think the answer is to challenge back and say, well, what sense are you trusting that tells you to challenge your own senses? And you can kind of see how it breaks down from there, I think.
Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit more? Because I'm not sure I understood the main point.
I think the main point is saying that we rely on sense perception to know axiomatic concepts. So I guess I'm thinking about, well, what if somebody challenges the senses and says, how can you trust your senses? How can you trust your mind? How do you know it's real? Right. And I think that the counter to that is to simply say, well, if you don't trust reality, if you don't trust your senses or your thoughts, why are you speaking? Why are you trusting your own question, your own challenge to the senses or the mind?
Yeah, I can see where you're going with that. The senses are the basis of appeal that we have in common with other people. And this is interesting. Jacob and I were just listening to a discussion about objectivism's perspective on atheism versus theism. And the objectivists will point out that they have to discuss things in terms of reason. That's the only way that they're able to have a discussion on whether or not God exists. And on that, I agree with them. I think that we need to be able to have the discussion in the realm of the things that we observe, and then our inferences about those things that we observe. And observation and inferences viewed together as a whole, I call that reason. So when I say reason is the basis of appeal, I don't mean my own thoughts are the basis of appeal. I don't mean I'm the standard of what's right and wrong. I mean, this process that we have is the human process. It's the human method of gaining knowledge. We observe things and we make inferences about them. And if there's anything outside of that that you want to use as your basis for appeal, then explain it. Try. But until you do, what other basis do we have? And if somebody is going to make a claim that your senses are not reliable, I could point out to them that in my method of seeking knowledge, all of my knowledge and all of my claims do eventually boil down to, I made an observation and now I'm describing it to you. So I would point out to them, are you claiming that my senses are not reliable sources of information by following that same method, by making observations about reality and then describing them to me? If you're doing that, do you see that you just violated an axiom? You violated the axiom that you're conscious. If you are not conscious, then you don't have anything to say to me. But if your senses are not reliable, then how can you claim to be conscious? What is your means of consciousness? And you could ask them, but eventually it does boil down to it results in a deconstruction of their attempt at deconstruction, which is hilarious. All right, I want to go next to Andrew, and then we'll go to Randy after that. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, just real quickly, I wanted to bring up a problem that arose in my mind as I was listening to something completely different from Leonard Peikoff, which is a history of philosophy course that's free, by the way, that I recommend. Then I want to give a reason why I don't think it's a problem. So he mentioned Aristotle, and he mentioned why Aristotle believed there was a prime mover. And then he said why he thinks that there is no need for something like a cosmological argument for God's existence. And he said existence itself is a primary. It's an irreducible primary, is what he said. So there's no use in saying where did everything come from, because in his mind the universe is eternal. And I started thinking, well, I don't think that's true. But does that mean that I have to reject his idea or his notion that existence is an axiom? But you can realize that you don't have to do that for this simple fact. If my parents hadn't met and had me, I wouldn't be here to be conscious. There's a reason, there's a cause of me being conscious. But that doesn't mean that my consciousness, the consciousness for me as the subject, as the thinking subject, is not an axiom. And so you can see how just because there's a cause for something, it doesn't mean it's not an axiom. And as a corollary of that, just because something is an axiom doesn't mean, and to use Jacob's distinction earlier of metaphysical versus epistemological, just because something is an epistemological primary, it's an irreducible primary, to use Peikoff's term, doesn't mean that there's not a cause of it. So if we think about existence, and this might not be an exact equation to the existence axiom, because we would say that God is subsumed by existence, the axiom of existence. But to say that because existence is a primary, an irreducible primary in our minds, therefore we shouldn't go looking for an explanation for why anything exists. That's not something that should concern you as a Christian, because you can see with consciousness that falls apart. Because on page 5, Peikoff says, even if biologists or physicists were someday to give us a scientific analysis of the conditions of consciousness, this would not alter the fact that consciousness is an axiom. So I just wanted to bring that up in case someone watching this had a similar problem in their mind, and then show that's not really a problem.
Cool, thank you for that.
I real quickly, let me give another answer to that, because this is important. This is going to be something important in our ongoing conversations with objectivists, and that is that so I think what you're touching on there, Andrew, is that the axioms refer to the sort of the abstract concept themselves. So existence as such, right? Existence exists. Peikoff explained it's not talking about any particular existent, right? It's not. I mean, you can apply it to any given existent, but the axiom existence exists is supposed to subsume any and all existence, whether we're aware of them or not, right? So, and that's why talking about the cause of any particular existent isn't a threat to the axiom, because the axiom is talking about existence as such. Now, part of the problem, though, is that a lot of objectivists will equate or equivocate between existence as such and physical existence, like the physical universe. And so if you're talking about the physical universe, then you can talk about what's the cause of its existence if you posit something non-physical existing. But if you up front, a priori, say that the physical universe is all that exists, so existence as such is equivalent to the physical universe, then you're right, or then Peikoff would be right in saying you can't ask whether there's a cause to that, because you'd be trying to step outside of existence. But that whole argument relies on equivocating between existence as such and the physical universe. It relies on begging the question up front about whether or not something non-physical could exist.
Great, I appreciate that. Let's go over to Randy, and this will be our last segment, and then I'll give us our close for today.
Thanks, Cody. I'm not sure if the topic I was going to bring up is going to fit in the few seconds we have left, but I'll bring it up anyway, and y'all can decide. As I started reading this, I wondered to myself, how important is an awareness of these concepts, the axioms? How important is understanding and knowing that you're thinking about those things to having a consistent epistemological foundation to work from? And I got to the top of page 9, where he points out the distinction between primitives having, as he calls it, an undeclared epistemological civil war, versus those who have the benefit of Aristotle and others who should be more aware of the concepts and maybe a more declared inner war, purposely being inconsistent with what they're aware of. And I wanted to unpack that a little bit as a group, but that's probably more than we have time for today. So maybe a shorter thing would be to say that if the overarching goal of our discussions together are to understand, where we would be consistent with Rand's philosophies and where we might depart, did anyone see any place today in the first part of our readings? Are there any departures that anyone would have recognized? I would say no, but maybe interested to what others would say. Maybe you could summarize that.
My own answer is I didn't see anything within this section that directly, made a jab at Christianity or said, hey, so obviously God can't exist. You'll find a lot of those later on, but in this section, I didn't see anything that I disagree with. Anyone else want to take the floor for that and say if there's anything that they disagreed with in this section? Randy, just to give a short answer, and we can discuss this more in future videos, but you were asking about why are these axioms necessary for epistemology and why is epistemology necessary? Actually, that touches on what I was going to say as our closing remarks for this video. The main purposes for understanding these axioms is so that you can pursue the truth, so that you can be an honest person. And if I make a claim, that such and such happened, that logically reduces to certain other things, like I'm aware of something and it is what it is. And then in this chapter, you'll see Rand points out that we have to understand that what is has primacy against consciousness. So me wishing doesn't make it so. That's the point. Well, if you want to be an honest person, you have to be the kind of person who says me wishing doesn't make something so. Me thinking it doesn't make it so. And so that's it's a helpful thing if you're going to try to be an honest person. Now, you don't need to have read Rand to be the kind of person who acknowledges that. Everybody acknowledges that. If you ask them or if you put them on the spot. But how often do you try to trace back, within any one of your beliefs? Am I just wishing this, or is it really true? Like how often are you willing to get honest with yourself and ask yourself, is there a difference between what I'm wishing or hoping or imagining versus what is actually true? And the more often that you're able to do that, I think that the more of a reality-oriented person you're going to be. So that's one reason why you'd want to have this ability. There are other reasons as well. If you are a parent or if you're a teacher, having the hierarchy of knowledge understood is going to make you a better teacher. It's going to make you a better pedagogue. Then another reason why you might want to have it is in the event of you encounter a bad teacher. Well, how do you point out their errors? So those are the kinds of reasons why you might want to have the strong understanding of these axioms. In case anybody came into this discussion without a really good grasp of what is philosophy, just to give you an informal definition of philosophy, it's the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge and of reality and of man's relation to it, to the world. So you could say it's a belief system. And so one of the reasons why we might want to ask ourselves, why do we need to know these axioms, is, well, do we want to have a belief system that is integrated? Do we want to have beliefs that are organized together in a principled fashion? And what philosophy is attempting to do is help us take any one of our principles, which are generalizations, any one of our main ideas about what kind of world we live in, and connect them together. And that's something that you don't necessarily find elsewhere. That's philosophy's job, is to teach us how to be principled about how we understand all of our principles. And so this idea of the need for principles comes up early on in this chapter because we are people, because we are long-range conceptual beings that think conceptually and that plan out our lives over a long range. Because of that, we have the need for principles. We have the need to come to generalizations, like I should take care of my body. And a sub-example of that would be I should brush my teeth, or I should not drive 100 miles an hour on the freeway. But those general guidelines, they integrate together into principles, like I should take care of myself. And without that principle, you wouldn't have a consistent outlook by which you can achieve consistent results in your life. So we need principles. And that is why we need philosophy. Not everybody needs to be a philosopher, but everybody could benefit from being in a society in which there are good philosophers, in which the teachers are good philosophers, in which the pastors are good philosophers. If you are a pastor and you are not a philosopher, then I think you should repent of that choice. I think you should learn how to think clearly. It's necessary to acquaint yourself with how knowledge works, how claims work, if you're going to be a good hermeneutician, if you're going to be a good exegete. You have to acquaint yourself with the methods, the organon is what Aristotle called it, the logic of how we gain knowledge. And you don't have a choice about whether you're going to be integrating knowledge. It's just a question of whether you're going to be doing it well or badly. And so I'm going to read, and this will be our close, just from the opening chapter. I guess it's on page 1 and 2. You have no choice about the necessity to integrate your observations, your experiences, your knowledge into abstract ideas, i.e. into principles. And then this is another quote from Rand. It says, what integrates your principles? What integrates them? Philosophy. A philosophic system is an integrated view of existence. As a human being, you have no choice about the fact that you need a philosophy. Your only choice is whether you define your philosophy by a conscious, rational, disciplined process of thought and scrupulously logical deliberation, or let your subconscious accumulate a junk heap of unwarranted conclusions, false generalizations, undefined contradictions, undigested slogans, unidentified wishes, doubts, and fears, thrown together by chance but integrated by your subconscious into a kind of mongrel philosophy, infused into a single solid weight, self-doubt, like a ball and chain in the place where your mind's wings should have grown. And And that summarizes the alternatives that we face. And that's true even for Christians. Do we have an integrated view of everything? You know, Christians are well known for having systematic theology, but will not be very good unless it has a prolegomena. And the prolegomena is going to be philosophical material. This is what Orthodox Christians, up until the time of the presuppositionalists and some other subjectivists and relativists and postmodernists, got into. Christians, historically, within Orthodoxy, have understood that philosophy is necessary for Christian theology. And so I'm going to say it's necessary for that, and it's necessary for life, to have a principled approach. And so this is one atheist's their take on how to have a principled approach to life. And there are going to be things in here that disagree with God, and that there are going to be things that we just say, well, sorry, you're just wrong because you disagree with God. And we can explain why. And that's what we'll be doing over the course of this book. But there's also great value in it. And I want to say, look at this with charity. Look at it in such a way that you can find what's good in it. And you can see that perhaps there are things in here that we as Christians would really benefit to know. Thank you, everybody that has participated live on the discussion. Make sure you are getting our email updates. You can go to christianintellectual.com/subscribe. Hey, thank you, everybody, for joining today, and I will see you next Saturday. God bless.